Hey, great to see you again. Welcome back to International Business, Belhaven University. This is Unit 4, Ethical Issues in International Business, but you're aware of the fact that this corresponds actually to Chapter 5 in our Hill and Holt textbook. So I hope you've been keeping up with your readings, hope you're doing well on all your quizzes, and we want to get involved in our ethical issues in international business here. And I think, again, like the session on culture, I think you'll have a lot of fun with this and find it very interesting. Again, it's not something that you don't know, but it's something that you're going to add some basic definition to some words that you probably hear and use, and maybe you don't understand the total applicability of those words. But we're going to try to put some flesh on these things. So this unit really introduces key concepts in ethics, corporate social responsibility, and sustainability. These are all buzzwords, but they're important buzzwords, and they're really more than buzzwords if companies actually follow through on some of these concepts. And within the framework of ethics, we're going to differentiate moral temptations from ethical dilemmas. And I think I'm going to present something to you that's going to be really unique that you've probably not thought of before when we talk about ethical dilemmas, and hope I give you something that that'll give you some food for thought and a different way of looking at things. We're going to be covering the following topics: employment, human rights, the environment, corruption, CSR, corporate social responsibility, and certainly sustainability. And so ethics in all of these areas becomes an issue across nations because of differing political systems, economic systems, legal systems, and cultural values. All the things that we've been talking about in the first 3 units. These things all affect our ethical behavior. So what is acceptable behavior in one nation may be considered totally unethical in another. So we're going to explore some of the more common areas where ethical issues arise in international business, and I've listed those for you here. Then we're going to move to ethical dilemmas, and then we're going to examine some philosophical theories that offer a foundational support for ethical decision making. And then finally, we'll look at some implications for how managers make decisions relative to hiring, promotion, organizational culture, sustainability, and corporate social responsibility. Before we do that, well, let me mention the unit objectives. Different approaches to ethics, recognize dilemmas, ethical dilemmas, and then identify the sources of unethical behaviors by managers in a global environment. Because you and I don't believe that people finish their degree in business or get a master's degree in business and go out and with the idea that they're going to lie, cheat, and steal, or they're going to behave in an unethical fashion. But it becomes more subtle in the way they make their decisions, and one thing leads to another, and before you know it, business managers are engulfed in an unethical behavior activity. So before we get to that, and I mentioned earlier that in units 2, 4, and 7, we want to discuss biblical foundations. So we want to build on what we've said in unit 2 about Galatians 4:4 and 1 Corinthians 4:6. And some of those verses in Matthew and in the first chapter of Acts. So let's revisit where we were. We said that this new movement started. This new movement later became Christianity, later incorporated the name the church, and it took different perspectives. And we talked about in the previous unit on culture how language and religion are important. We talked specifically about the development of the Roman Catholic Church and its movement west, and the development of the Orthodox Church and the Greek and the Russian flavors of it, and how it went to the east and to the north. But the technologies differ in scope and scale from the first century technologies. That is, the technologies today differ in scope and scale. But back then, the existing technologies, and I referred to it previously as infrastructure, made possible the diffusion or the spread of the Christian movement. And it also made possible the establishment of Christian churches and the codification of theology and doctrines, and then certainly the practice of worship that persist until modern times. Many of the things that we do in our churches regularly as a part of our regularly weekly activities, and sometimes periodic activities that we have, for example, Christmas, Easter, other high holy days. Those things began really in that first century, and they found their roots there, and then they grew and they bloomed and blossomed, and we even practice some of those today. So let's talk a little bit about the diffusion of the Christian movement. And we said it started with just a few people, but it started as a result of the convergence of Judaism bringing us light, and the Greek culture bringing us intellectualism, or we called it knowledge, and part of that was the language in which the New Testament was written, and then the Romans, the Roman culture, which really presented us with power, the power of the Holy Roman Empire, and the security that accompanied this power. And then we began to see the establishment of churches. So one of the things we want to mention here is the dominant role that Paul the Apostle, now he was not a disciple, there's no evidence that he met Jesus during Jesus' earthly life, but the role that Paul the Apostle played in this diffusion of the Christian movement. First of all, Paul was uniquely qualified to be a leader of this new group. Paul was a Jew. He was, if you'll remember your New Testament history, he was from Tarsus, which was primarily a Greek city. And Paul also was a Roman citizen. So when he writes that verse in 1 Corinthians, and he talks about the light of the knowledge of the power of God in the face of Jesus Christ, he's writing from a tripart cultural perspective, because Paul was all three embodied in one. He was Jewish, and he understood the Jewish law, so he would have had the light from Judaism. He was Greek. He spoke the Greek language. He had a Greek heritage in the city in which he lived. And he was also a Roman citizen. That plays an important role in the diffusion of, or the spread of the Christian movement, because Paul used his Roman citizenship often to his advantage to gain audiences with different people who could influence the acceptance and the spread of the Christian movement. So Paul, after I'm putting words into this that probably don't exist, but let's say he finishes his high school. They probably didn't have high school there, but he finishes his basic education in Tarsus, a Greek city, well-educated young man, and he goes to Jerusalem to study under the rabbis. And he's a top student. Paul knows the law, and he says, I was a member of the faithful of the faithful. I was one of the best in terms of being an adherent follower of the law. And that plays an important role when he begins to persecute the Christians in the early days. So here's a Jewish man now in a Jewish environment in Jerusalem, but with a Greek mindset. So let's say his heart may be Jewish, but his mind is Greek, but he also is a citizen of Rome, having never been to Rome, but having citizenship. And so when he brings this to the situation, he's uniquely qualified to be both a strategist, to work with other apostles and disciples to spread the Christian movement, to establish churches, but he also is equally qualified to do what I called the codification of theology and doctrine. Someone had to put into writing the important theology, which is the study of God. What do we believe and what do we know about God? And then the doctrines that proceed from that. So who was more capable of doing that than the Apostle Paul? And no one. Paul was the man of the hour at that time. So he brings forth a big part of what you and I would call the New Testament. So the Jews gave us, Judaism gave us light. They gave us the Old Testament, the law, the wisdom literature, the prophets. The Gospels were written by 4 different people, as you know. Acts was written by Luke, a Gentile, a physician, someone who was basically granted a job by Theophilus to investigate so that Theophilus could know exactly what this new movement was all about. So Luke wrote the Gospel of Luke with one view to being an investigator. He would have had good research abilities, and then he also wrote and documented for us the Acts of the Apostles as they moved throughout the Middle East and the Mediterranean and established the Christian movement and established these churches. And so that was Luke's role. But then the primary proponent of remaining parts of the New Testament, certainly John and Peter were there, but Paul is the one who's known for codifying theology and doctrine and put it into writing. And in our last unit, in Unit 3, we talked about how important religion is to culture and how important a document such as the Bible or such as the Quran was to religious movements. And so it's very important that we see Paul doing these things. So he had the tools at his disposal. He had the mind to do it, and he had the Roman network of roads and societal norms to be able to travel freely under the protection of his Roman citizenship and to help disperse this Christian movement. And then the practices which come out of much of his letters and some of the worship hymns, songs, and so forth, they persist even until today. So we see that technologies may have differed in scope and scale from the first century technologies today, but we have the same opportunity to do those same types of things. So I would ask a question, don't have an answer, so it's a bit of a rhetorical question. Who are those people today who are taking the church and spreading it throughout the world and having an impact not only in our social lives but in our business lives as well? So the rapid and persistent spread of the Christian movement depended on visionary leadership. You have to have managerial talent, and we just mentioned the primary one was Paul. In terms of he was a true leader who had vision. Now we'll get in, we'll get into this in Unit 7. But where did he get his vision? It was not man-made, and you and I believe that he had some supernatural leading from the Holy Spirit. We'll develop that at a later date. But managerial talent would be the language that we would use today to talk about Paul and his visionary leadership. Well, today, international business has to have managerial talent. We need to understand where that talent is coming from, and that talent has to be developed, it has to be grown, it has to be educated. Paul, as I've already mentioned, had real cross-cultural skills. He had a real familiar use of at least 3 languages. He may have spoken some other languages as well, but he certainly was fluent in all the writing and reading and speaking of Hebrew and of Greek and of Latin. He would have grown up with those cultures. He would have understood the religion. And now he understands the language, the cross-cultural skills, the multilingual abilities. And then he was politically and socially very sophisticated within his movement. And that was a primary ingredient in the spread of the gospel. Paul understood from his very earliest days, from his upbringing as a young man, as a young boy growing into manhood, in Tarsus, a very sophisticated Greek city, and he knew the implications of all of his Roman citizenship, so that he was politically and socially savvy, we would say. He had a sophistication that allowed him to be a primary, I would call it a mover and shaker of this movement, which later became known as Christianity and the Christian church. So continue to read those passages in Galatians, in 1 Corinthians, and in Matthew. There are some verses there, and certainly in the first part of Acts, and see what was happening at that time in the lives of these primarily men. There's some women, and they feature prominently in some of Paul's writings, and they were good aids and help to Paul, and some took leadership roles. But read about those and see how this persistent and rapid spread of Christianity came about and what was really undergirding that spread.